My daughter-in-law tossed my coat onto the frozen pavement, smirking as my son screamed for me to get out right in front of the neighbours. They thought they were discarding a helpless old widow. They did not know that as I reached for that freezing wool. I had already decided to dismantle the life they built. When the police finally arrived, everyone understood that his scream was not an eviction notice. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I am 68 years old, and my hair has long since turned the colour of the dirty slush piling up on the sidewalks of our Denver suburb. Since my husband passed away a few years ago, I have tried to make myself small in the house I shared with my only son, Michael, and his wife, Lila. I tried to be the invisible widow, the grandmother without grandchildren, the ghost in the guest room. But on that Tuesday afternoon, visibility was thrust upon me with the violence of a winter storm. The air in the kitchen was already thick enough to choke on. Outside, the Colorado sky was a flat, bruising grey, spitting snow that refused to stick to the warm asphalt but froze instantly on the concrete steps. I was buttoning my coat, preparing to walk down to the market for some beef broth and carrots, when the tension finally snapped. We were still living in the long shadow of a recent family tragedy, a grief that had curdled into bitterness for some of us. Lila stood by the granite island, her manicured nails tapping a frantic rhythm on a stack of overdue notices. She turned on me, her eyes wild with a stress I thought was about money. "You control everything," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You hover over us like a vulture. Eleanor, you play the poor, helpless old woman just to keep Michael on a leash. But I see you. I see how you drain him." I opened my mouth to speak, to tell her that the grocery money on the counter was all I had withdrawn that week. But she did not let me finish. She lunged forward and grabbed the lapels of my coat. It was a heavy wool thing, frayed at the cuffs, the kind of garment that screams fixed income. She yanked the front door open, letting a blast of freezing wind tear through the hallway. And she shoved me. She actually shoved me. Then she tore the coat from my shoulders and hurled it out onto the snow-dusted porch. "Get out!" she shrieked. "Just go." I stumbled out after it, the cold hitting my thin blouse like a physical slap. I had to bend down on the slick concrete to retrieve my coat. My knees cracked audibly, and my hands shook as I brushed the wet, freezing flakes from the wool. That was when I felt the eyes. The neighborhood was quiet, but it was a watching quiet. Mrs. Higgins across the street was pulling back her lace curtains. Mr. Henderson, 2 houses down, paused with his snow shovel mid-air. I could feel their gazes on my bent back. To them, I looked like trash being taken out, a senile burden finally being discarded by a weary family. Then Michael appeared in the doorway. He filled the frame. His face flushed a deep, alarming red. He looked from Lila, who was panting with the exertion of her rage, to me, shivering on the bottom step with my damp coat clutched to my chest. I looked up at him, my eyes burning. I expected him to yell at her. I expected him to pull me back inside and apologize. Instead, Michael lunged forward, his voice cracking like a whip across the quiet cul-de-sac. "Get out. Move now. Mom." It was a guttural roar. It sounded like pure, unadulterated hatred. He pointed a shaking finger toward the street. I stood frozen, the wind biting into my skin, stunned into absolute silence. I saw Mrs. Higgins shake her head in the window, likely mouthing the word pitiful. I heard the low murmur of someone saying it was a shame to kick an old lady out in this weather. Lila crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe with a satisfied smirk that chilled me more than the wind ever could. She had won. She had finally severed the cord. I opened my mouth to plead, to ask him why he was doing this. But Michael stepped down onto the top step. He invaded my personal space, grabbing my shoulders roughly as if to physically shove me toward the sidewalk. But then, for a split second, the anger vanished from his eyes, replaced by a desperate terror. He leaned in close, his lips brushing my ear. He whispered something rapid and low, a frantic string of words that stopped my heart cold. Before I could process what he had said, he shoved me back gently, turned on his heel, and slammed the heavy oak door in my face. The lock clicked with a finality that echoed down the street. I stood there for a long moment, the snow beginning to fall harder now. I pulled my coat on, buttoning it with trembling fingers, and backed away toward the sidewalk. I kept my head down, playing the part of the defeated matriarch perfectly. I walked past the judging eyes of the neighbors. Let them look. Let them think Lila had successfully evicted a leech. I wiped a tear from my cheek. But it was not from the sadness of being homeless. It was from the sheer, dark irony of the situation. They thought they had tossed a poor old woman onto the street. They watched me drag my feet toward the bus stop, assuming I had nowhere to go. But they did not know the truth. Michael did not own that house. Lila certainly did not own that house. In fact, neither of them even owned the land their driveway sat on. I stopped at the corner and looked back at the colonial-style home with its manicured lawn and the fresh coat of paint I had paid for 3 years ago. My daughter-in-law thought she was kicking me to the curb. In reality, she had just thrown herself out of a game she did not even realize she was playing. It was not the cold that killed my son. 3 weeks after he shouted at me on the porch, Michael was dead. The coroner wrote myocardial infarction on the death certificate, a heart attack at 44 years old. It felt impossible. I sat in the front pew of the small Baptist church on the edge of town, staring at the closed mahogany casket that looked far too large for the boy I remembered carrying on my hip. The smell of white lilies was suffocating, thick and cloying, masking the scent of damp wool and old wood that permeated the sanctuary. I felt entirely hollowed out, a shell of a mother left behind when the natural order of things had been so violently inverted. Lila sat next to me, a study in performative grief. She wore a black dress that fit a little too perfectly, the kind of silk that whispered money every time she shifted. She wept into a lace handkerchief at all the right moments, her shoulders shaking delicately when the pastor mentioned Michael's generosity, but I was watching her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt. Her phone screen kept lighting up. She was texting. Every time a vibration buzzed against the pew, her thumb would fly across the screen with a speed and impatience that did not match the devastated widow she was playing for the audience behind us. My mind kept drifting back to a lunch I had with Michael a month before everything fell apart. He had looked pale then, rubbing his chest over a plate of untouched eggs. He told me he felt heavy, like there was water in his lungs. But he had just seen our family physician. Dr. Evans had given him a clean bill of health. He said Michael's heart was as strong as an ox and that it was just stress. Stress did not stop a healthy heart in its tracks in less than a month. The official story did not sit right in my gut. After the service, the house filled with people holding casseroles and murmuring useless platitudes. I sat in the corner of the living room, feeling like a stranger in the home I had helped pay for. Lila, however, was in her element. She moved through the crowd with a glass of red wine, accepting condolences with a grace that felt rehearsed. I heard her speaking to Mrs. Gable from next door. Lila sighed loudly and mentioned that thankfully Michael had updated his life insurance policy recently, so at least she would not be destitute. The casual way she mentioned the payout while her husband was barely cold in the ground made my stomach turn. When the last guest finally left, the transformation was instantaneous. Lila locked the front door and leaned back against it, kicking off her expensive black heels. The grieving widow mask vanished, replaced by a look of sheer exhaustion and cold annoyance. She walked past me without a word, went into the study, and came back with a thick manila folder. She slapped it onto the coffee table with a sound that made me jump. "We need to be realistic. Eleanor," she said, her voice flat. "Life goes on." She opened the folder and pushed a document toward me. It was a quitclaim deed. It stated that Michael had transferred the title of this house solely to Lila 6 weeks ago. I picked up the paper, my reading glasses sliding down my nose. I looked at the bottom of the page. There was Michael's name, and there was a signature. But it was wrong. Michael had a handwriting style that was bold and assertive, full of sharp angles. This signature was shaky, the lines trailing off weakly at the end. It looked forced. It looked like the hand of a man who was either drugged or terrified. "He was in debt," Lila said, cutting through my silence. "The garage was failing. He was hemorrhaging money. Eleanor. He needed to transfer the house to me to protect it from creditors. It was a strategic move. I knew she was lying. I had given Michael the capital to start that garage 10 years ago. I saw his books every quarter. He was not just breaking even, he was profitable. There were no creditors chasing him." I looked up at her, ready to call her a liar, but she held up a hand to stop me. Her eyes were hard, devoid of any of the moisture that had been there during the eulogy. "Here is the reality," she said, her voice dropping to a steel whisper. "This is my house now. Legally. You have no claim here. I am giving you 30 days to pack your things and find somewhere else to live. If you are not out by then, I will call the Denver Police Department and have you removed for trespassing." I stared at her. She thought she had just played the winning card. She thought she had crushed me under the weight of her legal threat. But as I looked at that forged signature, and then up at her arrogant face, the shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I did not cry. I simply folded my hands in my lap. The corner of my mouth twitched upward, just a fraction of an inch. She had no idea what she had just started. I did not scream, and I certainly did not beg. When Lila delivered her ultimatum, I simply nodded, turned on my heel, and walked into the guest room. I pulled my battered suitcase from the top of the closet, the one with the broken zipper pull, and began to pack. I took only the essentials. I packed 3 sets of clothes, my toiletries, a small wooden box that I kept locked under the bed, and a thick, hardcover notebook with a spine that was cracking from use. As I walked through the living room for the last time, Lila watched me from the kitchen island. She was already on the phone, her voice bright and breathless. I heard her say that she needed a market appraisal as soon as possible because the property would be vacant by tomorrow. She looked at my old coat and my small suitcase, and her eyes glossed over me. To her, I was a defeated animal slinking away into the night. She thought my silence was submission. It was not. It was focus. I paused at the front door and ran my hand along the oak banister. My husband and I had installed this railing ourselves 20 years ago. I remembered the invoice for the lumber. I remembered the cost of the stain. Every single fibre of wood in this house had been calculated and paid for by a bank account Lila did not even know existed. She thought she was standing in a gold mine she had just inherited. She had no idea she was standing on a trapdoor. I hailed a taxi at the end of the block and directed the driver to a hotel near the financial district in downtown Denver. It was a place where businessmen stayed, not grandmothers with worn-out wool coats. When I approached the check-in desk, the young woman behind the counter gave my attire a skeptical once-over. She started to tell me the nightly rate in a tone one might use with a child, emphasizing that it was $300 a night. I did not blink. I reached into my purse and placed a heavy, black credit card on the marble counter. It was a platinum card issued to the Eleanor J. Marsh Revocable Trust. The receptionist went quiet, swiped the card, and handed me my room key with both hands. Once I was in the room, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the king-sized bed. I opened the wooden box. Inside was not jewelry or sentimental trinkets. It contained the original deeds to 6 commercial properties, a stack of stock certificates, and a silver business card belonging to Savannah Ortiz. Savannah was the brilliant young lawyer who had helped me structure the Marsh Legacy Trust after my husband died. I picked up the phone and dialed her private number. She answered on the second ring. I kept it brief. I told her that my daughter-in-law had just evicted me using a forged deed and that I needed to trigger the contingency clauses we had drafted 5 years ago. Savannah did not ask if I was okay. She knew better. Her voice dropped an octave, becoming deadly serious. She told me to meet her at the North Point building at 8 o'clock the next morning. I hung up and opened my notebook. I turned to a fresh page and began to write. I listed the assets. There was the row of rental units in 5 Points. There was the partial ownership of the office block on 17th Street. There was the logistics warehouse in Commerce City. And at the bottom of the list, I wrote down the address of the house in the suburbs that Lila believed was her new kingdom. People always assumed I was just a housewife who dabbled in gardening. They never asked about the 30 years I spent as the head of human resources and accounting at Blue Ridge Systems. They never knew that my husband and I lived on a fraction of our income and used the rest to buy dirt-cheap land when Denver was in a slump. We had built a fortune worth tens of millions of dollars, brick by quiet brick, hiding it behind a facade of middle-class modesty to protect Michael from his own worst impulses. I closed the notebook and lay back against the pillows. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the hotel room wash over me. In the quiet, I heard Michael's voice again. Get out. Move now. On the porch. Those words had felt like a knife to the heart. But tonight, in the cold light of my freedom, they sounded different. He had seen what Lila was capable of. He knew she was dangerous. He had not been kicking me out to hurt me. He had been screaming at me to run before the house burned down with me inside. The elevator doors to the penthouse floor of the North Point building slid open with a whisper, revealing the polished marble lobby of Ortiz and Lowell. The space smelled of expensive coffee and old money. I walked past the reception desk, clutching my worn leather handbag, looking every bit the displaced pensioner Lila imagined me to be. But the receptionist did not ask for ID. She simply nodded respectfully and buzzed me through the frosted glass doors. Savannah Ortiz was waiting for me in her corner office. She was a striking woman in her early 40s, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, highlighting eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She bypassed the handshake and pulled me into a brief, firm embrace. "I am so sorry about Michael." "Eleanor?" she said, her voice dropping the professional veneer for just a second. I nodded, my throat tight. But we both knew I was not here to weep. I was here to work. I sat in one of the leather chairs facing her desk and pulled out my phone. I showed her the picture I had snapped of the quitclaim deed Lila had slapped onto the coffee table the night before. Savannah adjusted her glasses and zoomed in on the screen. She pulled a file from her desk drawer, Michael's old business filings for the garage, and laid them side by side. She studied the signatures for less than 10 seconds before she let out a short, derisive huff. "This is Forgery 101, she said, sliding the phone back to me. "It is amateur hour. Eleanor, look at the hesitation marks on the loop of the M. And the slant is all wrong." Michael wrote with a heavy hand. He carved his name into the paper. "This looks like someone trying to draw his name." She stood up and walked to a wall of filing cabinets, unlocking one with a key from her pocket. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound binder with gold lettering on the spine. The Marsh Legacy Trust. She set it on the desk between us with a heavy thud. "Let's remind ourselves of the facts," she said, flipping it open. 12 years ago, after your husband's heart surgery, we moved everything. Every single asset, the commercial lots, the stocks, and the residential properties was transferred into this irrevocable trust. On paper. Eleanor, you own nothing. You are simply the primary beneficiary. I looked at the documents, the dense legal language that acted as a fortress around my life's work. The implication hit me with the force of a physical blow. That means Michael never owned the house, I said slowly. "Exactly," Savannah replied, a cold smile touching her lips. Michael was a tenant, a beloved tenant, but a tenant nonetheless. He had no legal title to that property. He could not have signed it over to Lila even if he wanted to. He was trying to give away the Brooklyn Bridge. That piece of paper Lila is waving around isn't just a forgery, it is a legal impossibility. She leaned back, tapping a pen against her chin. "So," she continued, her eyes narrowing. "Lila is currently occupying a property owned by the trust, based on a fraudulent document. That is criminal trespassing. It is fraud. And since she is trying to sell it for financial gain, we are looking at grand larceny." I took a breath, the anger inside me crystallizing into something colder and more useful. I told Savannah about Lila's claims that Michael was drowning in debt, that the garage was failing. Savannah made a note on her legal pad, underlining it twice. "Fabricating a financial motive," she murmured. "She is trying to create a narrative that justifies the asset transfer. But if the garage's books are clean, that lie falls apart instantly. Why lie about debt unless you are desperate for cash?" She looked up at me. "We are going to file a complaint with the Denver Police Department tonight. Eleanor, we will report the unauthorized occupation of trust property, but we are going to go a step further. Given the forgery and the sudden financial aggression, I am going to formally request that the coroner's office reopen the investigation into Michael's cause of death. When you combine a fake deed with a sudden death and a rush to liquidate assets, that is not just suspicious, that is probable cause." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below us, the city of Denver was waking up, a grid of grey streets and crawling traffic. Somewhere out there, in a house she did not own, Lila was probably measuring the curtains, thinking she had won. She thought she had kicked a helpless old woman into the snow. She had no idea she had just declared war on a corporation. She thinks she got rid of me, I whispered to the glass. Savannah closed the heavy binder with a snap. Let's see how she handles the Marsh Legacy Trust. She said, It is a lot harder to bully a $10 million fund than a 68-year-old widow. The silence in the house was usually suffocating, but this morning, to Lila, it sounded like victory. She paced the length of the living room, her heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm on the hardwood floors. She held her phone to her ear, her voice dripping with a confidence she had manufactured only hours ago. $750,000 is the absolute floor, she said into the receiver, pausing to take a sip of coffee. She was using one of Eleanor's favorite porcelain cups, the one with the hand-painted violets. It tasted better knowing the old woman was gone. I want this listed by the end of the week. I am looking to make a clean break. California is calling. She hung up with the agent from Mile High Property Group and let out a long, satisfied sigh. She could already see it, the ocean, the condo in San Diego, a life where she didn't have to pretend to care about a failing garage or a moping mother-in-law. She was finally free. Eleanor was probably crying in a motel room somewhere, or better yet, checking herself into a state facility. Then came the knock. It was not a polite, neighborly rap. It was 3 heavy, deliberate thuds that shook the heavy oak frame of the front door. Lila frowned, setting the porcelain cup down on the coaster a little too hard. She smoothed her black silk blouse, annoyed. Probably Mrs. Higgins from across the street coming to spy. She pulled the door open, a rehearsed scowl already on her face, but it froze instantly. Standing on the porch were 2 uniformed officers from the Denver Police Department. One was a graying, broad-shouldered man with Sergeant Blake stitched onto his uniform. The other was a younger woman, Officer Harris, whose eyes were hidden behind aviator sunglasses despite the grey winter sky. The static of their radios cut through the crisp morning air, a sharp, aggressive sound that made Lila's stomach clench. "Can I help you?" Lila asked, her hand instinctively going to the necklace Michael had given her. "Is Eleanor Marsh present?" Sergeant Blake asked. His voice was flat, professional, devoid of warmth. Lila straightened her spine, forcing a sad smile. "My mother-in-law is not here," she said, injecting just the right amount of weary grief into her tone. "She moved out yesterday. I am afraid she was quite unstable after my husband passed. This is my house now. I am Michael Marsh's widow." The officers did not soften. They exchanged a glance that Lila could not interpret, but it definitely was not sympathy. "Ma'am, we are not here for a wellness check," Officer Harris said, stepping forward. "We are here responding to a formal complaint filed regarding this property." Complaint. Lila laughed. A brittle, nervous sound. "That is ridiculous. I just told you. My husband left this house to me. I have the deed right here. We are acting on behalf of the property owner, the Marsh Legacy Trust," Sergeant Blake said, consulting a clipboard. "They have alleged unauthorized occupation of the premises and have requested we secure the scene pending a criminal investigation." Lila blinked. The words swam in her head, refusing to connect. The Marsh. What she stammered. "I don't know what you are talking about. My husband owned this house. He signed it over to me. According to county records, this property has been the sole asset of the Marsh Legacy Trust for 12 years. Sergeant Blake said. Michael Marsh was a trustee, not the owner. He did not have the legal authority to transfer the title to you or anyone else. Lila felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees went weak, and she had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. A trust. Michael had never mentioned a trust. Eleanor had never mentioned money. They were just normal, boring. Officer Harris held out a gloved hand. Do you have the document you claim transfers ownership? We need to document it. Lila scrambled backward to the entry table, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the manila folder. She pulled out the quitclaim deed, her golden ticket, her escape plan, and handed it to the officer. She expected them to read it and apologize. Instead, Officer Harris pulled out a digital camera and began photographing the document from multiple angles, focusing intently on the signature. This will be submitted to forensic document examination, Harris said, her voice cool. Forensic Lila whispered. And one more thing, Mrs. Marsh, Sergeant Blake added, his tone dropping an octave, becoming heavy with warning. The district attorney's office has requested that the coroner reopen the investigation into your husband's cause of death. Financial irregularities involving this trust have raised significant questions. You are hereby instructed not to sell, lease, or alter this property in any way. Do not leave the jurisdiction without notifying us. They handed the deed back to her as if it were contaminated. Lila stood there, clutching the paper, watching as they turned and walked back to their patrol car. The squawk of the radio echoed again, sounding less like static and more like a closing cage. She slammed the door and leaned her back against it, sliding down until she hit the floor. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. She looked at the phone in her hand. A notification blinked on the screen. It was an email from her lawyer, Trent. The subject line read, Urgent, undisclosed trust assets. Call me immediately. For the first time since Michael died, Lila was not thinking about how much money she was going to make. She was thinking about how prison orange would look against her skin. The fear started in her stomach and clawed its way up her throat, choking out the last of her California dreams. Eleanor was not just an old woman. She was a ghost, and she had just walked through the walls. The conference room in the offices of Ortiz and Lowell was designed to intimidate. It was all glass, chrome, and a view of the Rockies that cost a fortune. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, my hands folded on top of my battered notebook. Across from me sat Lila and her attorney, a man named Trent Holloway. He was exactly the kind of lawyer one hired from a billboard on the interstate too much cologne, a suit that was too shiny, and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Savannah sat to my right, looking like a shark in a tailored blazer. She let the silence stretch for a full minute before nodding at Trent to begin. Trent cleared his throat and leaned forward, clasping his hands theatrically. Let us be frank, he began, his voice booming as if he were addressing a jury. My client, a grieving, working-class woman, is being victimized. She is being forcibly removed from her marital home by a mother-in-law who has substantial hidden assets. This is a classic case of financial bullying. We have the deed. It is signed, sealed, and delivered. We are not leaving without a settlement that reflects the pain Mrs. Marsh has endured. Lila nodded beside him, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. She looked righteous. She looked ready to fight for the scraps she thought I had. Savannah did not blink. She simply slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood. It was the forensic document analysis report. That is an interesting narrative. Mr. Holloway, Savannah said, her voice dangerously calm. Unfortunately, it is contradicted by science. This is the analysis of the signature on your so-called deed. It concludes that the signature of Michael Marsh is a clumsy forgery. It shows hesitation marks consistent with tracing, and the pen pressure is completely wrong. Trent waved a hand dismissively. Michael was dying. He scoffed. He was weak. His hand shook. You cannot expect a man in the throes of heart failure to sign his name with the vigor of a 20-year-old. This proves nothing other than his deteriorating health. Savannah smiled. It was not a nice smile. She pressed a button on the console in front of her. The large screen on the wall flickered to life. This footage is from the security camera at Michael's garage, recorded 6 weeks ago, on the exact day this deed was allegedly signed. Savannah said, "On the screen?" Michael appeared. He was not frail. He was laughing, joking with one of his mechanics. And then he bent down and effortlessly lifted a transmission box weighing easily 50 pounds and carried it across the shop floor. He looked vibrant. He looked alive. Trent's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Lila went pale, her eyes darting from the screen to her lawyer. Now, let us discuss the assets you are so eager to claim. Savannah continued. She opened the thick leather binder of the Marsh Legacy Trust and began to read. She listed the apartment complex in 5 points. She listed the logistics warehouse. She listed the portfolio of municipal bonds. Trent looked confused. He was doing mental math, and the numbers were getting too big for the small game he thought he was playing. Who owns all this? He whispered. The Marsh Legacy Trust, Savannah said. And do you know who founded that trust, Eleanor Marsh and her late husband? I leaned forward then. It was time to speak. My husband and I did not inherit money. I said softly. Lila flinched at the sound of my voice. I worked in human resources at Blue Ridge Systems for 30 years. My husband was a carpenter. We lived on rice and beans. We bought land when no one else wanted it. We bought this city when it was dirt. You see me as an old woman with a cheap coat. You should have looked closer at the stitching. Savannah closed the binder with a heavy thud. And here is the final piece of the puzzle. Mr. Holloway. Even if that signature were real, which it is not, the deed would still be worthless. Michael Marsh did not own the house in Denver. The trust does. And as you can see from the property records. Savannah gestured to the glass walls around us. The trust also owns this building. We are currently sitting in my client's living room, so to speak. Trent Holloway looked as if he had swallowed a lemon. He looked at Lila with undisguised horror. He realized he had walked into a lion's den armed with a water pistol. Lila was staring at me, her face a mask of shock. I could see the gears turning. She was realizing that if she had just been kind, if she had just been a decent human being, she might have eventually been part of a dynasty. Instead, she had fought for a cottage and lost a kingdom. Since Michael did not own the house, he could not gift it, Savannah said, her voice dropping to a lethal register. Attempting to use a forged document to transfer a title you do not own is fraud. It is grand larceny. We have already forwarded the forensic report and the video footage to the district attorney. They are very interested in why a healthy man suddenly died right after his wife tried to steal a house she thought was his only asset. Trent stood up abruptly, gathering his papers with trembling hands. I was not informed of these particulars, he stammered, backing away from the table. I need to review my representation of this client. Lila sat frozen in her chair. She looked small. She looked young. She looked at me. And for the first time, she did not see a victim. She saw the architect of her destruction. The room was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. But in that silence, the sound of a closing trap was deafening. Savannah introduced me to a man named Darius Cole. He was a former Denver police detective who looked like he had been carved out of granite, with a face that had seen too much darkness and eyes that missed nothing. He did not offer me soft words or platitudes. He simply shook my hand with a grip that felt like a vice and looked me dead in the eye. He told me that if my daughter-in-law killed Michael, he would find the proof. It was the first time anyone had said the word killed out loud in my presence. It hung in the air between us, heavy and terrifying. But I did not flinch. I sat in the leather chair across from him and finally told the truth about that afternoon on the porch. I told him about the look in Michael's eyes, which I now realized was not anger, but sheer, unadulterated panic. I told him that when Michael leaned in, he did not just say, "Get out." He had whispered, "Mum, get out. Move now. Please, just go tonight." His voice had trembled. He was not throwing me out to please his wife. He was clearing the blast radius. Darius nodded, making a single note in a small notebook. Then he went to work on the money. He started with the bank records. It took him less than 48 hours to dismantle Lila's lies about Michael's finances. Michael was not in debt. His credit score was excellent, and the garage was generating a steady profit. Lila, on the other hand, was a financial ghost. She had no bank accounts in her name, no credit history for the last 5 years. It was as if she did not exist on paper. But Darius found where the money went. He traced the IP address from Michael's home router to a series of offshore sports betting websites. They were hosted in countries I had never heard of, but the losses were very real. He linked the accounts to an old email address Lila had used in college. The sheer volume of the bets made my stomach turn. She was not just gambling. She was hemorrhaging money. Then came the debt. Darius tapped his contacts on the street and came back with a name, Ricky Valenti, known locally as Ricky Numbers. He was a loan shark who operated out of a back room in a strip club on Colfax Avenue. Darius discovered that Lila owed him somewhere between $130,000 and $160,000, and she was months behind on payments. He showed us a grainy video clip from a security camera inside a dive bar downtown. In the footage, Lila was cornered in a booth by a man who could only be Valenti. He was leaning in close, invading her space. Darius read his lips for us. He said Valenti told her that if he did not see cash by the end of the month, her legs would be broken. The fear on Lila's face in that video was primal. She was a trapped animal, while Darius was digging into the dark underbelly of Lila's life. Savannah was working the legal angles. She discovered phone records showing that Michael had made 3 calls to Maria O'Donnell, the toughest divorce attorney in Denver, just 2 weeks before he died. Savannah reached out to Maria, and because of the criminal implications, Maria agreed to speak. It turned out Michael had done more than just call. He had already signed a draft petition for divorce. But the final nail in the coffin was the new will. Maria confirmed that Michael had drafted a testament completely disinheriting Lila. He explicitly stated that in the event of his death, all his personal assets, his car, his savings, his share of the business were to go to me. Darius sat back, looking at the web of evidence he had spun. The picture was now horrifyingly clear. Lila was drowning in 6 figures of gambling debt. She had a loan shark threatening to cripple her. She knew Michael was about to divorce her. She knew he was about to cut her out of his will. If Michael lived, she would be on the street with nothing but a broken pair of legs. But if Michael died before the divorce was filed, she became the grieving widow. She would get the life insurance. She thought she would get the house. She did not kill him for love or passion. "Eleanor," Darius said, his voice low and gravelly. "She killed him because he was her only way to pay the bill." I closed my eyes, feeling a fresh wave of grief crash over me. Michael knew. In those final days, he must have realized what she was. He told me to move now because he knew the house was not a home anymore. It was a crime scene waiting to happen. When the police froze the house and the coroner agreed to exhume Michael's body, Lila realized she could not win in a courtroom. So she decided to win in the living rooms of every family in Denver. She knew she was losing the legal battle, so she ignited a media war. She called Josh Carmody, a reporter for Channel 7 who was famous for chasing ambulances and spinning stories about the little guy fighting the system. Lila handed him the perfect script on a silver platter. I sat on the edge of my hotel bed, my hands trembling as I watched the 6 o'clock news. The screen showed my front porch, the very spot where my heart had broken. Lila was sitting on the top step, wrapped in one of Michael's oversized flannels, looking small and fragile. She was clutching the sleeve of the shirt to her face, sobbing dry, heaving sobs that looked devastating on high-definition television. The reporter's voice was deep and grave. He narrated a story of a grieving widow, a working-class woman who had just lost the love of her life, only to be preyed upon by a ruthless, wealthy landlord. Then he put my picture on the screen. It was an old photo from a company picnic, but they had darkened it, making me look severe and cold. "Meet Eleanor Marsh," the reporter said. To her neighbors, she is a quiet pensioner, but public records reveal she is a real estate tycoon who owns half this block. And now, she is using her high-priced lawyers to throw her son's grieving widow onto the street. Lila looked into the camera, her eyes wide and wet. "She has always hated me because I did not come from money," Lila said, her voice shaking perfectly. "She controls everything." That day on the porch, Michael asked her to calm down about the finances. She started screaming. She threw things. She ran out into the snow just to make a scene, to make Michael feel guilty. She is a monster. She told me I had 30 days to get out or she would crush me. I stood up and threw the remote control across the room. It hit the wall with a crack. The rage was hot and blinding. She was rewriting history. She was taking the most painful moment of my life, the moment her husband tried to save me, and turning it into a weapon to destroy my reputation. I reached for the room phone. I was going to call the station. I was going to scream the truth until someone listened. Savannah reached out and clamped her hand over mine, pushing the receiver back into the cradle. "Do not do it." "Eleanor," she said, her voice sharp. "She is lying." I shouted. "The whole city thinks I am a monster." "Let her lie," Savannah said, her grip tightening. "Every word she says on that broadcast is recorded. If she lies about the eviction, that is perjury in the court of public opinion. If she lies about Michael, that creates inconsistencies. If we fight her in the mud, we get dirty. We stay clean. We wait." While I was pacing the hotel room, feeling the walls close in, Darius was putting the media storm to use. He knew that men like Ricky Valenti watched the news. He knew that a loan shark would see Lila's face plastered on every screen and realize that she was becoming too famous. A spotlight on Lila meant a spotlight on her debts, and eventually, a spotlight on the man she owed. Darius went back to the strip club on Colfax Avenue. He sat down with Ricky and explained the new reality. He told Ricky that the police were looking at a homicide charge. He explained that if Lila went down for murder for hire, the man she owed money to would be the first accomplice the district attorney would look for. Unless, of course, that man became a witness. Ricky Valenti was a criminal, but he was a pragmatic one. He chose self-preservation. He handed over his phone. Back in the hotel room, the news segment was ending. Lila was on the screen again, looking at the camera with a tear rolling down her cheek. "I just want to keep the home my husband left me," she whispered. "It is all I have left of him." Darius walked into the room at that exact moment. He did not look at the television. He opened his laptop and set it on the desk in front of me and Savannah. "He gave us everything," Darius said. I looked at the computer screen. It was a transcript of text messages between Lila and Ricky. I read the dates. They were from 3 weeks ago. I read the final message, sent 2 days before Michael died. "Please just give me a little more time." Lila had written, "I have a solution. After the end of this month, everything will be paid in full. I swear. Michael will not be a problem anymore." I looked from the laptop to the television. On the screen, Lila was playing the saint. On the computer, she was signing my son's death warrant. The contrast made my blood run cold. She had not just killed him. She had planned it, and she had texted about it like she was scheduling a dentist appointment. Marcus Bell, the district attorney, sat across from me in the small hotel room, his hands clasped over a file that contained the permission forms to exhume my son. It was a request that went against every instinct I had as a mother. I wanted Michael to rest. I wanted to believe that he had simply slipped away. But the evidence Savannah and Darius had gathered was a screaming alarm that I could not ignore. I signed the papers with a shaking hand, looking up at Marcus with dry, burning eyes to ask the only question that mattered. I asked him if my son had suffered. Marcus looked away for a moment before telling me that we needed to find the truth to ensure justice. The answer came 3 days later in a sterile report that read like a horror story. Michael had not died of a sudden myocardial infarction. His heart had stopped. Yes, but only because his blood had lost the ability to clot. The toxicology report showed massive concentrations of warfarin and superwarfarins, the active ingredients in heavy-duty rodenticide. It was not a single dose. The medical examiner concluded that the poison had been introduced into his system gradually over the course of 4 to 6 weeks. It was a slow, agonizing accumulation that mimicked fatigue and flu-like symptoms until his internal organs simply gave up. Darius connected the final dots with a cruelty that was necessary. He presented receipts and CCTV footage from a home improvement store 3 miles from our house. There was Lila, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, purchasing a large canister of pellet-style rat poison. She was the only one who made Michael his morning coffee. She was the one who refilled his daily vitamin organizer. The police found the matching empty canister at the bottom of our outdoor recycling bin, hidden inside a cereal box, along with vitamin bottles that had been opened and resealed. She had been feeding my son death, spoonful by spoonful, while smiling across the breakfast table. The civil hearing regarding the property dispute took place on a Tuesday. The courtroom was packed, the benches filled with reporters hungry for the conclusion of the widow versus mother saga. Lila sat at the plaintiff's table with Trent, looking every inch the victim. She wore a modest navy dress and kept her head bowed. Trent stood up and began his opening statement, painting me as a vindictive matriarch trying to steal a home from a grieving woman. Savannah waited for him to finish. She stood up, her movements calm and precise. She did not argue about fairness or emotions. She simply handed a thick binder to Judge Harriet Bloom. She explained that the property in question had been an asset of the Marsh Legacy Trust for over a decade. She explained that Michael Marsh was a beneficiary, not an owner, and therefore had absolutely no legal standing to transfer the deed to anyone. The deed Lila held was void, regardless of the signature's authenticity. Judge Bloom flipped through the documents, her expression hardening. She looked over her glasses at Trent and dismissed the civil claim with a bang of her gavel that echoed like a gunshot. Lila looked up, confused, her mouth opening to protest. But Savannah remained standing. "Your Honor," Savannah said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the gallery. "The defense yields the floor to District Attorney Marcus Bell, who has compelling information regarding fraud and criminal conduct related to this case." The air in the room shifted instantly. Lila froze. Trent looked around, realizing too late that the civil suit was just the trap to get them into the room. Marcus Bell walked to the center of the courtroom. He did not look at the judge. He looked directly at Lila. He laid out the timeline with brutal efficiency. He spoke of the $160,000 in gambling debts. He spoke of the threats from Ricky Valenti. He spoke of the divorce papers Michael had signed but not filed. He spoke of the new will that disinherited Lila. And then he spoke of the rat poison found in Michael's blood. Lila began to shake. It was not the delicate trembling of a grieving widow anymore. It was the violent shivering of a cornered animal. Marcus picked up a single sheet of paper. He told the court that they had obtained communication between the plaintiff and a known loan shark. He read the text message aloud, his voice devoid of emotion. "After the end of this month, everything will be paid in full." Marcus read, "I swear. Michael is very weak now. It will not be long." The silence that followed was absolute. Every reporter, every clerk, every person in that room stared at the woman in the navy dress. Judge Bloom looked at Lila with a mixture of horror and disgust. Two police officers, who had been standing at the back of the room, stepped forward. The jingle of handcuffs, the only sound in the dead quiet. Lila stared at the table, her face draining of color, as the narrative she had built collapsed on top of her. The criminal trial of Lila Marsh for the first-degree murder of my son was a spectacle. But for me, it was a blur of medical terms and timelines. I sat through days of testimony about blood clotting factors and rat poison residue. I watched the jury's faces harden as they looked at the woman who had played the grieving widow so perfectly on the evening news. But the real weight of the verdict did not land until the sentencing hearing. When Judge Bloom asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood up. My legs felt heavy, but my hands were steady. I walked to the podium and unfolded a single piece of paper. I did not look down at it. Instead, I looked straight at Lila. She was sitting at the defense table, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that made her skin look sallow. Her wrists were cuffed and chained to her waist. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a sullen, terrified glare. I told the court about the Michael that did not make the headlines. I did not talk about the business owner or the husband. I talked about the boy who used to help me in the garage. I talked about the time we built a bookshelf together and how he laughed when he accidentally hammered his own thumb, calling me old lady with that lopsided grin of his. I wanted them to know that she had not just stopped a heart. She had extinguished a light. Then, I turned my attention to the day that started it all. I looked at the judge and spoke clearly. I said that on the day my daughter-in-law threw my coat into the snow, the whole neighborhood thought they were watching a son choose his wife over his mother. I admitted that I thought so too. I thought he was betraying me. But I was wrong. He was not kicking me out. He was trying to evacuate me. Savannah stood up then. She asked the court for permission to play one final piece of evidence that had been recovered from the cloud server of the smart doorbell system. It was a clip that Lila had never deleted because she did not know the microphone was sensitive enough to pick it up. The courtroom went silent. On the speakers, the sound of wind and shouting filled the air. Then came Michael's loud voice, screaming for me to get out. But immediately after, there was a rustle of fabric, and then came the sound that stopped my heart. It was Michael's voice, but it was a breathless, terrified whisper close to the microphone. "Mom, please, just leave tonight. I think she is hurting me." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Then Lila shattered it. She jumped up, the chains rattling violently against the table. She screamed that it was a lie, that it was fake, that we had manufactured it. Her lawyer tried to pull her down, but she was frantic. The technician, however, had already authenticated the timestamp and the voice signature. The twist was undeniable. My son's last act of rebellion was not against me. It was for me. I looked at her one last time. I did not raise my voice. I told her that she did not just kill my son. I told her she killed the future he wanted to build with her. I told her that she did not get the house. She did not get the money. And she certainly did not get the final word. I told her that the truth belonged to him. And now, so did justice. Judge Bloom did not hesitate. She looked at Lila with eyes like flint and delivered the sentence. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Lila began to scream as the bailiffs moved in. She shouted that it was all my fault, that I was the villain. But her voice was drowned out by the clinking of chains and the heavy thud of the courtroom doors closing behind her. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, cold Denver afternoon. I had my old wool coat draped over my shoulders. It was the same coat she had tossed into the snow. I paused on the steps and looked back at the stone building. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs. "You told me to get out." "Michael," I thought, looking up at the grey sky. I got out that day. I left so that I would be alive enough and strong enough to drag the truth out into the light today. I walked toward the parking lot, my steps slow but sure. I did not have a grand plan for tomorrow. I did not know what I would do with the empty house or the money. But as I unlocked my car, I knew one thing for certain. I had finished the job. I had forced the world to say his name correctly, and I had turned his final, desperate warning into his vindication. Thanks for listening to my story. I would love to know where you folks are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, smash that like button, and hit the hype button to help this video get recommended to more people.